Do you know who I am?
Your guardian, founder of the Lanterns. May I ask you a question?
This is when most candidates ask, why me?
What if the biggest mystery in Lanterns isn't actually who the Manhunter is, but why the Guardians have been hiding it this entire time? Episode 3 looks like it could finally start pulling back the curtain, because everything we've seen so far is pointing toward a much bigger Green Lantern story than just Hal Jordan and John Stewart hunting down one dangerous alien.
Founder of the Lanterns. May I ask you a question?
This is when most candidates ask, why me?
Sinestro is back. Fear is becoming a major part of the story. John Stewart's entire childhood may have been shaped by the Guardians, and the Manhunter mystery could connect directly to one of the darkest events in Green Lantern history. And if this show is really planting the seeds for the Blackest Night prophecy this early, then the Manhunter might only be the beginning of something much bigger. So let's break down what Episode 3 is really setting up, because there are a lot of details here that could change everything. From the very first episode, the Manhunter has been treated less like a creature of the week and more like a symptom of something bigger. Hal Jordan and John Stewart aren't just chasing a killer, they're chasing answers the Guardians clearly don't want them to have. And that's the key detail everyone's missing. The Guardians aren't confused about what's happening, they're controlling the flow of information. Every time Hal or John gets close to the truth, there's hesitation, redirection, silence. That's not the behavior of an organization caught off guard. That's the behavior of an organization protecting a secret they've been sitting on for a very long time. Think about it from a storytelling angle, too. If the Manhunter really was just a random rogue threat, there'd be no reason for the show to keep cutting back to the Guardians' closed-door meetings, their guarded expressions, their carefully chosen words whenever Hal or John ask direct questions. That kind of narrative weight is reserved for something with roots, something that goes back further than this one case. Episode 3 is positioned to be the moment that silence starts cracking, and once it does, Hal and John might not like what they find underneath it. Sinestro isn't just back for nostalgia, his presence reframes the entire Manhunter storyline. Sinestro's whole arc in Green Lantern lore is built around fear. Using it, weaponizing it, believing it's a more effective tool for order than willpower ever was. If the show is bringing him back now, right as the Manhunter mystery deepens, that's not a coincidence. It suggests fear itself is becoming a driving force in this story, not just as a theme, but as something tied directly to what the Manhunter actually is and why the Guardians are so desperate to contain it. There's also the philosophical clash to consider. Sinestro represents everything the Guardians publicly reject: control through fear instead of willpower. But if the Guardians are hiding something this dark, this desperate, doesn't that make Sinestro's worldview look a little less wrong? That's the kind of moral gray area this show seems to be building toward, and it's exactly the space where a character like Sinestro thrives. This is where the show starts hinting at something much older and much darker than a single rogue alien. Something that might justify, in the Guardians' minds at least, the very methods they claim to be against. Here's where it gets personal. John Stewart's backstory isn't just character development, it's foreshadowing. If John's childhood was shaped even indirectly by the Guardians and their decisions, then his entire arc in this show isn't really about hunting the Manhunter. It's about uncovering how deep the Guardians' interference actually goes into his own life. That changes the emotional stakes completely. This isn't a soldier doing his job anymore. It's a man who might discover the people he trusts most have been lying to him since he was a kid. And that recontextualizes every scene we've seen John in so far. His discipline, his caution, the way he seems to hold something back even around Hal, all of it starts to look less like personality and more like a defense mechanism built by years of unseen manipulation. If Episode 3 confirms even a piece of this, it turns John from a supporting lantern into the emotional core of the entire season. Episode 3 looks like the turning point where that thread starts pulling tight, and once John starts asking the right questions, the Guardians may not have an answer that keeps his trust intact. It's worth stepping back and looking at the bigger pattern here, because fear isn't just Sinestro's theme, it's becoming the show's theme. Every major beat so far ties back to it in some way. The Guardian's fear of what the Manhunter represents, John's buried fear rooted in his childhood, and now Sinestro's return bringing fear back as an active force in the world. When a show repeats a concept this deliberately across multiple characters and storylines, it's rarely an accident. It's usually the thesis the whole season is building toward. That matters because in Green Lantern mythology, fear isn't just an emotion. It's a color, a power, a weapon. If Lanterns is laying this groundwork now, in Episode 3, it's setting up fear to be more than subtext by the finale. And here's the part that should make every Green Lantern fan sit up. If the show is planting seeds for something connected to the Blackest Night prophecy, one of the darkest, most consequence-heavy events in Green Lantern history, then the Manhunter isn't the endgame, it's the trigger, a single thread in a much bigger tapestry the Guardians have been trying to keep buried. That would explain the secrecy. That would explain why fear is being woven so deliberately into the story through Sinestro. And it would explain why the Guardians would rather let Hal and John stumble in the dark than tell them the truth. A prophecy of that scale isn't something an organization like the Guardians would announce. It's something they'd bury under layers of half-truths and quiet containment, exactly like what we've been watching unfold. If that's really the direction this is heading, Episode 3 isn't just another case of the week. It's a small piece of a much longer countdown. So, heading into this episode, here's what actually matters. Does the show finally give Hal or John a real answer, even a partial one, instead of another dead end? Does Sinestro's presence start to connect directly to the Manhunter case rather than existing as a separate thread? And does John's backstory get enough screen time to confirm whether the Guardian's fingerprints are really on his past? If Episode 3 delivers on even one of these, it validates everything the show has been quietly building since Episode 1. And if it delivers on all three, this stops being a Manhunter mystery and becomes something much closer to the opening chapter of a Blackest Night story. So, heading into Episode 3, the real question isn't just who is the Manhunter. It's, what are the Guardians so afraid of that they'd rather risk their own lanterns than reveal it? If this show is building towards something as massive as Blackest Night, then Episode 3 might be the first real crack in the wall. And once it breaks, there's no going back. So let's actually sit with that question for a second. What are the Guardians so afraid of that they'd rather risk their own lanterns than reveal it? Because once you start pulling on that thread, almost every strange decision they've made in this show starts to make a different kind of sense. Think back to how the Guardians have been portrayed so far. They're not written as incompetent. They're not written as careless. Every single choice they make is deliberate, calculated, and controlled. That's important because it rules out the simplest explanation, that they just don't know what the Manhunter is. An organization that ancient, that powerful, that obsessed with order across the entire universe does not stumble into ignorance. If they're being quiet, it's because speaking would cost them something far greater than a delayed investigation. And that's really the core of what makes this mystery so compelling. This isn't a "we don't have the answer yet" situation. This is a "we have the answer, and giving it to you would break something we've spent centuries trying to hold together" situation. That's a completely different kind of tension, and it's the kind of tension that great science fiction thrives on, because it turns every conversation with the Guardians into a puzzle. You're not just listening to what they say, you're listening for what they're avoiding. Now layer Sinestro back into this. If Sinestro's entire philosophy is built around the idea that willpower alone isn't enough to maintain order, that fear is necessary, that some threats can only be controlled through force and dread, then the Guardian's secrecy starts to look less like caution and more like guilt. Because if the truth about the Manhunter is bad enough that even the Guardians are terrified of what happens if it gets out, then maybe Sinestro's worldview isn't the extreme, dangerous outlier the Corps has always painted it as. Maybe it's the natural response to something the Guardians themselves are too afraid to name. That's a genuinely uncomfortable place for the show to take its audience, and it's exactly why Episode 3 feels like such a pivotal moment. Because once Hal or John get even a fragment of the real story, they're not just going to be dealing with the Manhunter anymore. They're going to be dealing with the realization that the organization they've sworn their lives to may have been managing them the same way they're managing this threat. With silence, with control, with information handed out only when it's convenient. And this is where Jon Stewart's arc becomes so critical to the bigger picture. And if his childhood really was shaped by Guardian interference, even in small, quiet ways, then his personal story becomes a preview of exactly what's happening on a much larger scale with the Manhunter case. The Guardians didn't need to lie to John outright. They just needed to guide, nudge, and withhold at exactly the right moments, the same pattern we're seeing play out with Hal right now. If the show draws that parallel clearly in Episode 3, it elevates John from the other Green Lantern in the story to the emotional proof of exactly how the Guardians operate when they think no one's watching. There's also a structural reason to believe this show is thinking bigger than a single-threat storyline. Shows built around a monster of the season formula tend to front-load explanation. You learn what the threat is early, and the back half is about defeating it. But Lanterns has done the opposite. It's held back information deliberately, 3 episodes in, while surrounding that mystery with world-building that has nothing to do with catching the Manhunter directly. Sinestro's ideology, John's past, the Guardian's internal tension. That's not how you structure a simple hunt. That's how you structure a slow reveal of something much larger sitting underneath the hunt. And if that something larger really does connect to Blackest Night, then everything happening right now, the secrecy, the fear, the buried history, isn't just flavor. It's the first domino. Blackest Night, at its core, is a story about what happens when death and fear stop being separate forces and start working together. If Lanterns is quietly building toward that idea this early, through Sinestro's fear-driven philosophy and a threat the Guardians won't even name, then Episode 3 isn't just deepening a mystery. It's laying the first stone of a much larger foundation. That's also why the pacing of this reveal matters so much. If the show rushes to explain the Manhunter fully in Episode 3, that would actually undercut the weight of everything being built. But if Episode 3 gives just enough, a partial truth, a flicker of what the Guardians are hiding, maybe a moment where Sinestro says something that lands differently than expected, that's the sign the show knows exactly what it's doing. Controlled reveals are how you build a mystery that pays off later instead of one that fizzles out. So here's what to actually watch for. Watch how the Guardians react the moment someone gets close to the truth. Not what they say, but what they refuse to say. Watch whether Sinestro's presence starts to feel less like a villain reappearing and more like a mirror held up to the Guardian's own methods. And watch Jon Stewart closely, because if his personal history starts overlapping with the Manhunter mystery even slightly, that's confirmation the show is connecting its character arcs to its central plot on purpose, not by accident. Because if all 3 of those threads start converging in Episode 3, this stops being a simple case of catch the dangerous alien. It becomes the opening chapter of a story about an organization that chose control over honesty. And what happens when the people who trusted that organization finally start asking why? So let's take that idea one step further, because it raises a question the show hasn't fully answered yet. What actually happens once the truth comes out? Not if, but when. Because a secret this carefully guarded doesn't stay buried forever, especially not when you have 2 determined Green Lanterns actively digging into it. So the real question for Episode 3 and beyond isn't just, will they find out? It's, what does finding out actually cost them? Think about what it would mean for Hal Jordan specifically. Hal's entire identity as a Lantern is built on a certain amount of faith. Faith in the ring, faith in the core, faith in the idea that the Guardians, however distant and mysterious they seem, are ultimately working towards something just. If that faith gets shattered, even partially, it doesn't just change how Hal sees the Manhunter case. It changes how he sees every mission he's ever completed under Guardian orders. Every fight he thought he understood the reason for suddenly gets thrown into question. That's not a small narrative shift. That's the kind of revelation that can define a character for an entire series. And for Jon Stewart, the stakes are even more personal. If it turns out the Guardians shaped his childhood in ways he never knew about, that's not just a professional betrayal. It's an intimate one. It means decisions that felt like his own. Moments he might have credited to his own resilience or his own choices were quietly influenced by an organization he had no idea was even watching him yet. That's the kind of discovery that doesn't just anger a character. It makes them question which parts of their own life actually belong to them in the first place. If the show handles that reveal with the weight it deserves, it could be one of the most powerful character moments in the entire season. Now zoom out and think about the core as a whole. If word gets out, even informally, even through whispers among other lanterns, that the Guardians have been sitting on information this significant, it doesn't just damage Hal and Jon's trust. It damages the entire foundation the core is built on. The Green Lantern Corps only works because thousands of beings across the universe trust that the rings, and the organization behind them, represent order and fairness. Crack that trust in one corner of the universe, and it has a way of spreading. That's the kind of consequence that turns a personal betrayal into a galaxy-spanning problem, and it's exactly the sort of escalation that would justify positioning this story as a lead-in to something as massive as Blackest Night. It's also worth considering how Sinestro fits into this next phase. If the truth does come out even partially, Sinestro is exactly the kind of character who would seize that moment. Not necessarily through violence or outright betrayal, that's too simple for a character this calculating, but through influence. Imagine Sinestro pointing to the Guardian's secrecy as proof of everything he's ever argued. That the Corps' leadership is flawed, that pure willpower without control is naive, that fear exists for a reason, and pretending otherwise only leads to disasters like the one Hal and Jon are currently investigating. If Sinestro uses this moment to plant doubt, not just in Hal and Jon, but in other Lanterns who start hearing rumors, that's how you get a slow ideological shift rather than a sudden dramatic betrayal. And slow ideological shifts tend to make for much more compelling long-form storytelling than instant villain reveals. There's also the question of what the Guardians do once they realize their secret is slipping. Do they double down and tighten control even further, risking alienating the very Lanterns they need loyal?